one of the huge innovations of anthropology back in the day was to say that culture was what governed our behavior, and that's what made people different in different ways. And then in some ways, culture was more important than whatever your race or your biology or your genetics, they may not have used that language, would have been. And I think, at least from some of your web posts, this is still an important lesson. Or maybe it's come back to us and we have to say it again. So for example, on page 163 of Guest, where he has those 6 pictures of people that we'll talk about in a bit. Variations of skin color or other visible characteristics often associated with race are shaped by less than 0.1% of our genetic code. Contrary to certain stereotypes, they do not predict anything else about a person's genetic makeup, physical or mental capabilities, culture, or personality. And so in some ways, that's still the same message that people were talking about 100 years ago, when some of the first anthropologists basically said, no, when people have cultural capabilities or the ability to do things or learn different languages, that your social upbringing, your culture, is more important than your race. And that as a result, we could educate people to become more culture conscious. They would become conscious of this fact, and if we could just educate enough people to understand. And the early anthropologists really didn't necessarily, they may have accepted the idea of racial categories, but they just insisted that culture was a much more important determinant than race, and they were seeking to minimize the role that race would play as a determinant. Now that was a good time in anthropology, and in some ways, some of the people that are most associated with, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., quoted from early anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict. That would have been part of their, the ideas that were behind some of the civil rights movement. Some of the W.E.B. Du Bois, who's from an earlier time, was frequently interacted with Franz Boas. So this was seen as something that was crucial for the civil rights movement in the United States and the attainment of some form of racial equality, or at least getting rid of the worst laws that governed race. Starting in around the 1960s, anthropology in some ways and other scientific disciplines got more sophisticated about what race was genetically or biologically, as we started to sort of peer into the human genome a bit more and into the biological variation. And it became in some ways scientifically, you might say, more obvious that race is this sort of huge block category. That thing that we just described is the idea that somehow one characteristic, such as your skin color, should biologically shape all sorts of other things, just didn't work. And so we began to say something that some of you latched onto. Jada, what should we say about race? What is race? What kind of a thing is it then, if it's not biologically valid? Yeah, so it's not, from a biological perspective, it's not necessarily real. It doesn't really say much about us. And so, yeah, this idea, which has been done in many times in anthropology and other classes, to educate people into the idea that race is a social construct. It's something we have in our heads, and it's something we act upon, but it doesn't really correspond to something genetically, biologically out there in the world. And so the belief is in anthropology that we really need to tell people this, and we've been doing it for, I don't know, 100 years or so. And even to this day, late last night, I could barely sleep working on my slides, got in here, zipping things around, because somehow I feel like if I can just do it this time, if I can just do it right, everybody will be educated, we'll walk out of here, light bulbs will be going off, and society is going to get better. To this day, I still Still think about this class, this particular one. So I think we should go through both of those ideas because, as you said in your web post, some of these are not are not entirely as well known as we should know them. So one of the ideas, or one important point that we talked about I know we talked about this from the very first class, because I always talk about this one, is that humans, since we became humans, probably slightly before we became humans, have been mixing and mating and moving around and seeing who fits into the species idea. And we always find out that all human beings are part of one interbreeding species. And if you go from one end of the globe to the other and up and down the globe, you can always get people together, and willy-nilly, they will often test out the species concept biologically and find out that they can produce viable offspring. And this has been true for hundreds of thousands, maybe a couple million years. That's just something that people do. It's not something that happened just recently or overnight. This is just a hallmark of our species. And as a result, PJ, what do we know about most human variation that we see as we look across the world? Maybe not across our classroom, but across the world. What would we know about human variation, about the variability of human beings? I'm thinking more about just the graduality of it. Does that make sense? You don't remember that one. Most human variation is gradual. That is to say, it's, it's not that there's a strong line between people of different heights, of different nose shapes, of different hair forms. It occurs gradually across a range. I'll throw up a map of the globe pretty soon, and you'll see how this works with skin color. The scientific term for this, or the term that biologists use, is that this graduation is clinal. It occurs along gradients or along clines. And so this is but the biologists talk about variation. I mean, there can be blocks of variation that are sharply defined in other species, but most human variation is gradual. There are also some things that combine and recombine independently, as we know from Mendel. So simply having a certain type of hair form, or a certain type of nose, a certain type of skin, or a certain type of body shape doesn't necessarily go with all these other traits. Or lactose tolerance, or malaria resistance. All of those things can combine and recombine so that people of various skin tones and colors and shapes and sizes all can independently combine and recombine these traits. And so we have certain stereotypes about people who have a certain skin color in the United States and the shape of their noses and mouths and lips, and that has something to do with where people are from. And if you go into Africa, you will see plenty of variation in terms of nose sizes and lips and all those things as well, all across the continent. And so what this means is that the idea that people come in these big race categories, Black, white, Asian, are a pretty crude. I mean, they do describe something, right? But they don't really describe the real human variation that we see. And we could actually, I mean, there is a role in biological anthropology and other disciplines to describe the real human variation, but trying to group it and categorize into races simply doesn't work. If I categorize all the people together who are lactose tolerant and those people who are lactose intolerant, we'll see certain patterns, but it will group together some of the lightest skin looking people with some of the darkest skin looking people, depending on whether your ancestors were cattle herders and depended on milk and cheese or not. And we could go on and on about all kinds of different traits that either independently recombine or are gradual. So let's talk about the skin color thing for a second, because we get really hung up on this. So this is a map of the world, and this is kind of how skin color would have looked perhaps before people started flying around a lot and crossing the oceans a lot. That is to say that near the tropics, skin color tends to be darker. And as you get to the north and south, skin color tends to lighten out. Now, like I said, today we can fly around. And so if we fly from, say, Europe to Asia, we'll be convinced that people look very different on each side of that flight. But if we took a walk, as Guest puts it, if we take a walk across what is the Silk Road, for example, we'll see a whole gradual range of variation across all these places. And in no place will we be able to say, aha, I'm crossing over from the Europeans into the Asians. And in fact, if you go to some of these places, like, around here in like Uzbekistan and stuff, you'll see people and they're like kind of look intermediate, you might say. Same thing with skin color as if we took a walk from Norway all the way down into Africa, there'd be variation as you took that walk, but the variation would be gradual. And again, there's no point at which you're like, wait, I'm across the line now. I've crossed a river and now I'm with the Black people. No, they're like gradual variation all the way through. And the same thing happens within Africa or within India, for example. All of these things are very clinal. And so skin color is one of those things. It's a human trait that exhibits almost perfect clinal variation. We could line up all the people in the world and there's no way to draw a line between where one variation starts and one ends. Most people today believe the science that has come in on this is that this clinal variation happens from a natural selection process, which has to do with one kind of blocking the sun's rays if you live in a tropical climate, absorption of vitamin D if you live in areas like this one where you can't get much vitamin D. And now we can culturally do all these things. We can take vitamin D supplements, but in the old days, there was perhaps a slight advantage in certain climates to demelanize. Dinging, thank you. So this led to a very famous statement in 1962. The anthropologist Frank Livingstone stated, "There are no races, there are only clines." And what he meant by that, for one thing, he didn't mean that there was no biological variation. He said, but that biological variation was clinal, that is, it is gradual, and could not be sorted into these blocks of things that we call races. So like I said, this was a very important statement. We could go on about the genetics of this as well, but this was kind of since the 1960s, I would say, people have known that biological variation was gradual. So, Amy, if this is the case, then where do we get races from?
Colonizers.
Colonizers. Yay. Yeah, Well, so basically, as we started to make transoceanic voyages and take certain people from certain areas and put them in different places and put them next to each other, make sure that they tried to force them into working in different places, it is actually a fairly recent human invention in the last 500 years, the idea that people come in these racial blocks or racial categories. Now, again, that's not to say that people didn't think about biological variation beforehand. Of course, people did. But they didn't necessarily block it off. And I would also say that there's a variation in how those colonial systems developed. So we're going to talk about the US system in comparison to Brazil, for example, but there's all kinds of different ways. Most of these happened in the Americas. So when Guest talks about the global construction of race, this usually came to us from the Americas, which was where people were moved the most from. And you can maybe see here, there's another sort of skin variation map like the one before, that certain people were basically left out of the classification scheme of the Americas, like the people in India, who can range from very, very dark skin to very, very light skinned. And in the United States, they're not really included in our racial classifications. Asians in general are not very well typified, you might say, or we don't, because they weren't usually part of the colonial system. Now, these ideas of superiority, inferiority, imperialism, and especially, we might say, the whole reason that people were dragged from Africa to the Americas in the first place. Right, so I showed you this chart at the very beginning of the class, kind of where different people who were enslaved got taken to, and their rough demographic numbers, more or less as represented by these arrows. And certainly the category of race was used to eventually to justify this kind of treatment. I just want to, these arrows, in the book, it talks about this little island of Hispaniola that got divided into Haiti and the Dominican Republic was once called, when it was a Haitian or French colony, Saint-Domingue. It's hard to see from these lines, but there were almost 800,000 Africans were taken to this very small island in the Caribbean, which is almost twice as many. The United States or North America got about maybe almost 500,000, 470,000 by some estimates. So there were several islands in the Caribbean. Jamaica got almost 1 million Africans, definitely more than twice of all of North America. And of course, we talked about, or will talk about, Brazil, which probably got about 4 million, or about 40% of it, almost half of the entire trade, almost all of whom were taken to try and grow sugar. So this leads us to the idea, or it leads us back into Guest's idea of how race is constructed around the world, and especially other racial classifications like Brazil.
Morning.
Lights on. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I have to turn those lights off again. We talked about a little bit about how, so in Brazil, they're very, like I said, they'll examine people's skin tones and might have very different and variable categories for them. There's also an idea that as you might change your social class, there's a very famous phrase in Brazil, money whitens. So as you're going up the ladder, you might be able to change your racial classification as you go up there. There's also the fact that there's, the demographics of Brazil are quite different. So Josie, what do some people think Brazil is like?
Well, as Gus was describing in a chapter of racial democracy, in a sense that I'd say generally this is more of a Latin American thing in general, as well as Brazil, but generally speaking, Brazil is contrasted from the United States in a sense that Europeans specifically were more inclined to sort of have children with people of other races. And over hundreds of years, that sort of made, I'd say a majority of Brazilians have very mixed backgrounds and heritage from around the world, to the point where a lot of people consider it sort of a racial democracy where people of all races sort of live in harmony, which isn't really the reality of it, but.
Yeah, so I mean, there's been this scholarship on Brazil, part of it coming from the United States, but part of it coming from Brazilians themselves who say, hey, we got it made here. We're a racial democracy. Everybody's living in harmony, and the demographics of it are quite different, right? I mean, it is quite amazingly different, like in terms of the population and the percentage of this. I think I will be reading in this book, although I don't think we actually read about, in this class, I haven't scheduled you to read about Monticello and Thomas Jefferson. One of the big differences is that in Latin America, in the United States, people did have relationships, but they were often unrecognized and continued as enslaved. Whereas in Latin America, they would sometimes, in certain countries, be seen as sort of legitimate members of the family. So the idea was that, this is great there. My take on this, and you mentioned the reality, and we'll talk about this. My take on this is a lot of times this happens because people would go to Brazil from the United States where they felt kind of not the best, especially people who might be African American in the United States, and would go to a place like Jamaica or go to a place like Brazil and be like, it's great here. Right? It's like, wow, so many people that, I'm not a minority, I'm part of the majority. And so, I think some of the outside scholars felt freer there. And it also corresponds with what the national mythology that Brazil wanted to promote, that we're all getting along. And unlike you up in the United States, we all are happy. Now, the reality of this, as Josie mentioned, is not so great. Enormous inequalities in Brazil, one of the most unequal countries in the world, you might say, so high concentrations of wealth. And most of that wealth is concentrated in people that look fairly light-skinned. And so eventually we may talk about the idea of colorism or light skin preference, which happens within different groups of people. But that seems to be the case in many Latin American countries, this desire or this favoring of people who are of lighter skin and in some ways a privilege there as well. So if you live in Brazil, you may not feel like it's a racial democracy, or if you're not at the top of the hierarchy. But this is, it's an interesting, different way to do race. Yeah.
I mean, beyond that, the history of Brazil is probably one of the most racist in human history. Beyond 40% of all African slaves going there, it was one of the last nations on earth that outlaw slavery as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know if I want to get into a contest for that, but yeah, we could also talk about their, the pretty harsh obliteration of indigenous communities and much of the Brazilian Amazon, et cetera. Yeah, it would be competing with us for sure. Yeah.
Would this also kind of tie in with like the colorism anyways? A lot of Nazis immigrating during the kind of World War II.
There were a couple of South American countries that got really into these ideas. Brazil, Argentina too, was trying to import Europeans in general and sort of, make sure the right kind of Europeans were there and whiten everything up. Yeah, there were some very strong sort of whiteness ideologies in Latin America. So yeah, the people who see this as a racial paradise or racial democracy, you kind of have to be careful with that. But it is a really interesting, like I said, it's an interesting place for different ideas about race. And it certainly can be true that people who feel like they are a minority in the United States and they're huge, for example, legal restrictions that have been in place, could go to a place like Brazil or even Argentina or Jamaica and feel like, wow, it's better here. So I guess we've talked about this a little bit, but how we do race in the United States. Sorry, I want to turn off the lights again. Now we can see her. My pictures are better now. There's Halle Berry, who in 2002 won an Oscar for Best Actress in a Leading Role. Why was that a big deal? Yes.
Was she the first or the youngest?
First African-American actress to win best actress, or yeah. So I think there had been some other winners in different categories, but in terms of best actress, that was the first. So this was a big deal. First African-American. Anybody know who that is? Her mother. Her biological mother, by the way, who raised her. There you go. You can see it. We're going to take a guess that her father looks different. How do we know that Halle Berry is Black? That's her mother, by the way. How in this country can you be a different race than your own mother? That's kind of weird, right? Yes, Paige. Her dad is considered to be African American or Black. And so we have this idea in the United States that we look at skin color. Like I said, in Brazil, they'd be looking at skin colors and they would tell you that these people, if we had all three of them, were three different races or three different kinds of people, and that we don't actually look at skin color. We have this idea of some sort of descent, and there's these special rules we'll talk about in a second with blood and how these things are sorted out. Just want to go ahead, Joe.
I think sort of here it's kind of an all or nothing game where if you're even a little bit like have a darker skin, then you're not considered white. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do know what you're saying. We're going to talk about that in a second. I just want to say here, before we get into the, well, go ahead, Jada.
I was gonna say how like about the descent or the blood aspect, how like I forgot that name, but like a person like they look white, like it was like the one possible. That's like the great grandfather was Black and you are considered Black, you have like a failure skin protection.
It does get kind of crazy. I mean, and people would like scrutinize other people to make sure, and if they had anything, they'd be like, hey, what's going on there? Yeah.
I feel like that is true, but I feel like there's also like this contrasting group of people that have the idea that like if you have one white parent or one parent that's something else, you're not Black anymore. No, you're the other thing.
I think,
You don't count.
yeah, I mean, I think that's also, yeah, I mean, I guess it does work both ways. I'm going to talk about the legal aspects in a second, but I just want to say one thing about this. How many more Black people have won Best Actress since 2002? How many more have there been? This was the first. How many more in the last 21 years? None more. Zero. So it's interesting because actually Halle Berry was interviewed recently about this moment, and she says, you know, she thought it was going to mean something, but it meant nothing, in the sense that she thought it was like going to break the boundaries and do all this stuff, and it really didn't. Yes, we do in this country, we have what Guest refers to, or anthropologist refers to, as a rule of hypodescent. That is to say that the child's race is lowered, and I've used that in quotes because again, typically, traditionally, you get the race of what is least favored in society. So if you have a combination of two people, white and Black, then typically the offspring are classified as Black. And as Jada says, in some states, this was actually legally enforced. So if you have 1/4, that would be a grandparent, then you're considered Black. If you have 1/8, I think we're getting to great grandparents. And then in some states, I think it was Louisiana that said, if there's anything, the 1-drop rule, any African ancestry, and that's what you are. And so some people just decided, it's like, all right, I'm going to put away the picture of my great grandfather, and I'm going to move to Iowa. And the next time somebody asks, I'll just say I'm white. Change your race. Other people can change their race by going on a plane and going to a different country. So, for example, we talked about how certain people who look a certain way in the United States might go to a Latin American country and be received quite differently. And in many Latin American countries, they actually use a different kind of rule, which is hyperdescent, which is the idea that you can sort of go up the ladder. So you're seeking that kind of, and again, it also is a form of colorism, but the idea is you can lighten yourself and sort of ascend the race ladder, or that if you get mixed, like they might not call Halle Berry black or white. She might be in a mixed category, which would be its own category. Yeah.
From my personal experience, I've also experienced this sort of thing where my best friend growing up, his name was Gino, and he was Southern Italian. And during the winter, his skin would get fairly pale, but during the summer, his skin would get very dark to an extent. And it was really crazy seeing him being treated differently based on the time of year it was. So I just find it really interesting that, your skin color can also change based on, your environment as well and how you live.
Yeah, I mean, and I was going to mention that about Brazil. Like, see, people talk about their race changing over their lifetime, depending on what they've been doing. But some people would talk about their race changing seasonally. And so it would be like winter, summer me, and it would be different. It's interesting that you say that about the Italians. I've saved some stuff about the Italians and other kind of ambiguous European categories for next class. But yeah, so here we were. Like I said, see, I'm really super invested in getting this all right, because if I can get it right, the world will become a better place. That's what we thought, right? That in some ways, this is where we came from, that if people could understand that our social backgrounds were more important than race, or if we understood that race is a social construct, that it isn't genetically or biologically valid, that the world would become a nicer place. So, question, how did that work out? How's it been working? So good. Yeah, we won, right? 100 years of anthropology, and it's all flowers now. No, it has not worked out very well. So from about 2001, roughly speaking, to the present, there's been some things that have happened. One thing is that the idea that race is socially constructed has been wildly misunderstood. That is to say, if you walk down the street and you say race is a social construction, they'll either say, "What are you talking about?" and pull in somebody else and say, "Look at him and look at me. You're telling me this is a social construction?" So on the one hand, you'll just be laughed at out of court. Or the other idea is that it's like, oh, it's just a social construction, as if it's meaningless.
Yeah.
And so it's like, what are you doing? Just get over it. It's just a social construct. What do you need it for? And so, I mean, in the same way that we talked about money is a social construct. It's completely socially constructed. There is no value to that stuff that is printed on a piece of paper, except we all believe it in our heads. However, I am not about to just merely social construct my way away from the bank. If I can just get to the bank and get some of the money, it's going to mean something in my life. So things that are socially constructed, see, the thing is most people think when we say socially constructed, we mean it's not real, but it is real. It's very real, and it has huge effects on our lives. So it's wildly misunderstood. I don't even use that phrase anymore because people just don't understand it. The other thing that happened, I think, is that all these forensic anthropologists or people like them got on TV and they're holding up a bone and they're like, "This is a black man, go get him." I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but I feel like shows like Bones, they make it seem like these forensic anthropologists can just go out there, look at a bone and tell you it's race. Now, this is not a class where I'm going to go through and tell you what the complex process of it is that we do probabilistic measurements to do that. If you want to, though, if you're not getting that from wherever, I will go through why that doesn't exactly work the way it's shown on television. We've also seen that people can buy these DNA kits and they swab around and they send it off and they tell you that they're 72% Irish and 13% this, and it's all quantified, or they're, that they need to take a certain medicine because of their race. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't do these things, but whenever we have people who are going to sell you something, you just have to watch out for what they're selling. And the idea that race can be in some ways quantified like that is interesting. We talked about this a little bit from before when we're talking about globalization. Yeah, it hasn't worked out that well, right? The idea that people should be of a certain ethnic category, and that we'll talk about this in the next class, that nations are made up of certain ethnicities and that other people don't belong there, has been getting more exciting lately. And so this has happened in our own country, as we know, but it's also happened in other places in the world. The other thing that happened is around September 11, 2001, there were some things that happened, and all of a sudden people, all these kind of old stereotypes about people in the Middle East and from certain regions and from certain religions, stereotypes that anthropologists had thought we were getting beyond, all of a sudden came back, and people started using words like barbaric and evil and all those things again. You know, I'm not saying people don't do bad things, but whoa, people got really excited about that. Now, on the one hand, the structure of racial inequalities in terms of wealth, where people live, where people go to school, all those things, this continues. This is what is called institutional racism. Right, Amy? What's that?
Nope, just left my brain. Can't do that to me.
Can't do that to you. I might do that to you later on. Start percolating in it. So, at this one hand, institutional racism continues in terms of where people go to school, how much wealth they have, where they're able to get health care, maternal health outcomes. But many white people think that racism is over and that it ended sometime back in Martin Luther King or something. That's why it's all done now. And one of the reasons is they are thinking of what is called individual racism. So, you know, I do hope that there aren't perhaps as many slurs and individual things going on and that people don't have those as much, but that's not like, that's a different thing from institutional racism. Percolating yet? No, okay, fine. It'll come back. It might not. Now, the question sometimes that we ask, or I ask, is like, here we had, again, remember, we had all this success in anthropology, and we used to hang out with people like Martin Luther King Jr. and be the go-to people on questions like race and culture and those things. But now, what do we do in this situation in which things haven't worked out the way we thought? Now, some anthropologists say, well, we need to bring back cultural relativism. You know, the idea that if we all appreciate how different people have different drums and different hats and different dance styles, that everything will work out. And certainly cultural relativism is probably better than nothing. I'd rather have you be culturally relative than culturally unrelative. That's, you know, I don't want straight up ethnocentrism. So interestingly, remember this, I had you fill out this quote. I changed a couple words there because I thought the language, I didn't want you to get thrown off by the language of civilizations. It might give it away when it was written. Let's see, most of you agreed, and most of you thought it was written pretty recently, like the 1980s to 2000, 1960s, blah, blah, blah. We had no winners, no winners, no winners. Yeah, this was actually Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture from 1934. And so this was a time when, you know, I mean, it's interesting. To me, this language does feel very relevant to me today. And I'm not sure why you said it was from 1980 to 2000, but maybe you thought it was like recently relevant. I don't know. Does anybody want to defend why they chose 1980 to 2000? Why did you choose that time? That was the most picked. Doesn't matter. Anyway, this feels very recent. Like I said, it feels like something somebody would have said recently, actually. But it's an old message in anthropology. And so a lot of people wanted to bring back cultural relativism. I showed you this quote before. A lot of people started using it again on their syllabuses. And, you know, they put it up and republish. Oh, they also put out like several different versions of patterns of culture were put out from 2000s. They kept republishing it because they thought it was a good message. Now, as you can tell, I'm a little bit suspicious of simply bringing back cultural relativism. So some anthropologists have started to talk a little bit differently about race and especially about racism. And this, I think, is where Guest starts to go in this chapter, which is not just to talk. It used to be that anthropologists would kind of stop after they disproved race is biologically real. And Guest is here talking, and other anthropologists have talked about how, yeah, no, but racism is a real thing and it has real consequences in the world, including how people are treated, and it includes biological consequences. So, you know, the fact that you might be going to a different school or a different hospital or have different life outcomes are also a biological thing. And so in some ways, racism is linked to our biology. Again, it's not a genetic link, but it definitely has a biological effect, enduring various forms of racism. So this has been one of the things that anthropologists start talking about. We also, that's a good color for that slide, I think. Some people have started talking about whiteness. Whiteness. Right, Alex? Whiteness.
Yeah,
What is whiteness?
so I used a quote from that page, it says, anthropologists refer to white as an unmarked category, one with tremendous power, but one that typically defies analysis and is rarely discussed.
Oh, wow, that's a great quote. I love it. An unmarked category. An unmarked category. So a sort of default. You know, like it's just what you assume is the standard. And so what Guest and others are here trying to do is call attention to this as a category that you often don't see. And as you quoted, people usually don't talk about it. You don't discuss whiteness. It's not something that people talk about, and it is difficult to analyze, in part because there is no is to it. There's nothing there. Whiteness is usually defined by what it isn't. Usually define the people out there and the people who are excluded. So sure, there are perhaps some things, there's some content that passes into the category of whiteness, but that's always shifting. And so whiteness is something that is often defined by what else is out there and what people are trying to mark off as other or different from them. It's usually, it's primarily a category of power and privilege. And so we've started talking about white privilege, right, Tiana? Yeah, even in other classes. What have we learned?
What it is.
Yeah.
Well, one of the ways it's been described is as this mostly unconscious and taken for granted set of advantages that is kind of given to white people as they go through life. And yeah, like you said, there's different ways it connects, but in a way it relates back to like power and status and wealth and how generally that helps to privilege white people to have better rankings in those.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So white privilege refers to an overall system of privilege, which is often invisible. I like to say that we often think of racism as like the bad things that happen if you happen to be on the wrong side of racism, but there's a whole structure here of privilege, which certain people talk about as the unearned benefits of whiteness, right? You didn't do anything to deserve it. I didn't do anything to be included in this category. I don't have to do anything to keep earning the benefits of it. It's just there for me. Now, I want to be careful about this because, you know, every time you're like, white privilege, it's not distributed equally. So people in different regions of the country or different social classes or by gender or sexuality may not feel the same amount of white privilege that other people do. So we have to be careful about this. And Shaylin, when we talk about things like class, gender, and sexuality and how they intersect with race, what are we talking about then?
And with that, the intersections of them having, potentially two minority groups or demographics combined creates a whole other minority group on its own that is often looked past and not acknowledged. It could be hurtful to certain people.
Yeah, so Gus mentions this term intersectionality, which is perhaps more prevalent in other places than in anthropology. In fact, he only mentions it there and then it doesn't come up for the rest of the chapter, which is interesting. It'll come up again, don't worry, but it's just important that whenever we're talking about things like race, that we consider these other categories together. Sometimes they are additive. Let's say, if you are experiencing both of these categories, they can add up to being worse, but sometimes they kind of offset each other. So being, of a high social class, but different sexuality might in some ways not be as bad as it seems, you might say. Jada, you talked about this as like people getting to the finish line. Used a sports metaphor for white privilege. What do you mean by that?
Essentially it's like a ranking or a hierarchy, so these people have white people or white cis males, they run the country and they're the top tier essentially, and how they got to where they are now is to white privilege because they are a white straight man. So it's easier for them to get to where they want to be in life compared to anybody else who's not a white straight man. But especially if you're not white, period, or if you're not a man, you have to go through multiple obstacles just to even get an inch of what they have.
Yeah, now I like that you used a kind of sports or game analogy. There was a person, author a while back, who wrote a blog post that I would recommend, especially if you're having trouble explaining what white privilege is to a person who doesn't believe in it. Because what he was saying is that some people get offended by the idea that they have privilege. And so what he did is he took it as a video game. Straight white male, the lowest difficulty setting there is. And what he was trying to say is it might be hard. It might be hard for you to play the game, straight white male, but you're playing at the lowest difficulty setting. And other people have to jump through, as Jada just explained, other hurdles. So, it's just an interesting, different way to talk about it. In part because, oh yes, I said it, institutional racism was coming back. So institutional racism, it goes with this idea of white privilege that, that our social structure is unequally differentiated in terms of our schools, our hospitals, our wealth. And that in some ways, that's what makes the benefits of white privilege possible. So I don't have to engage in racist talk or thoughts in order to just kind of sit back and get the benefits of being included in the white category. So Eduardo Bonilla Silva wrote a book guest mentions called Racism Without Racists. So, it's the idea that in some ways we still live in a very unequal society, but the people that are reaping the benefits maybe in the old days, it was more obvious, people were, you could talk about what we call individual racism. In these days, it's you don't need to necessarily do anything active in order to reap those benefits. And so this is distinguished between individual racism, which usually is what most people think of when they think of as racism, like slurs or slights or thoughts that people have in their head about other races. And so we have to be careful here, because if we get too focused on individual racism, then we might ignore institutional racism. However, I don't want to entirely ignore individual racism, because many people of color and different experience what is referred to as microaggressions. So, Gus gives the example of, you speak such good English, or, just assumptions about where people come from. that sort of reinforce the racial hierarchy. And, we should realize that simply being colorblind, this idea that I don't see color, does not actually help the situation, that we have to understand the structures that we have inherited and continue to live in. So now we're up to the point where we can say, so remember, anthropology first said that culture is more important than race, and we tried to educate people. Then we said that race wasn't genetically or biologically valid, and we tried to educate people. We decided that that didn't work out. So now, yes, we're going to be talking about how racism is real and has real effects, including biological effects. And now I'm going to educate you about white privilege. How's that working out? Yeah, when was the last time you tried to explain white privilege to somebody? They were like, oh, it's all making sense now. Yeah, that hasn't been working out either. So I would say that unfortunately, anthropologists have still been trying to catch up with where we need to go. Because anthropological belief is that if we could just educate enough people, if I just had enough people in the classroom, if I just did this lecture right, if I could just convince people, then racism goes away. Then people wouldn't be mean to each other. And what we never quite said, and Guest is getting closer, but I don't think he ever says it. We never quite said is that racism is what made race in the first place and continues to make it. And basically, the racism came first, then race. So anthropologists often think that racism results from ideas about race, when what really needs to be said is that race results from ideas or race, or, well, that's why I gave you that quote on the back of this. I don't know. Did they talk about this at the event? This little quote from the tour guide. He's getting a tour of New York City, of Wall Street. And the tour guide says, Damaris, race is a byproduct of racism. That come up? It's so nicely phrased there. In fact, race doesn't exist. Damaris said this in the way a person might say water is wet. So then she says it's a social construct. Then she talks about the work, or he talks about the work of Karen Fields and Barbara Fields in a book called Racecraft, which is written by a sociologist and a historian. I think they're sisters, which is that basically says that, it's racism that comes first and produces race. So we're still catching up to that. The person who I think almost got us almost there in anthropology is the person I've talked to you about, Michel Rolph Trouillot, who gets cited in Guest here, the Haitian anthropologist, who in 2003 asked, is racism a delusion about race, or is race made salient by racism? That is the crux of the matter. And as I've told you, Trouillot is one of the smartest people I've ever met, and he was too smart for the public. And he was too smart for most anthropologists. This book was supposed to be read by anthropologists, but they couldn't figure it out. In part because I think he asked this as questions instead of just making statements. So in my dumber rephrasing of Trouillot, you would say this: racism is what makes race salient. By salient, we just mean important or noticeable. So like I said, he was getting close, but we didn't listen. And so as a result, racism isn't just some fiction or a false belief, a delusion about race. You can't fix racism by educating people about race. And you can't educate people out of institutional racism. And that's why my lectures and my slides and my classes will never work. In fact, you might say there's a little bit of a paradox. I mean, we might be able to we might be able to educate some people on individual races, right? We might be able to kind of smooth off the edges. But there's kind of a paradox that the more educated you get, the more invested you become in institutional racism. Let me put it to you this way. Let's say you get educated, get a nice job, get some money, move up a little bit in the world, buy a house, have a kid or two. What's one of the first things you're going to want for those kids? Huh? Yeah, you want a home. That's one of the first things. Got to have a home. That is first. Food, you want some good food. That is true. You're thinking good. You're thinking good. Then, yeah, then you want to get them into a good school. You want to get them a good educator, especially if you've already been educated. You know that's helped you out. So what am I going to do if I'm an educated person? I'm going to try and find a good school. Where am I going to find these good schools? Places which have a huge property tax base so they can fund a good school. And I'm not saying that everybody out of a well-funded school is going to be great, but all of a sudden I've become invested in moving out of wherever I was up in the world into a different neighborhood where I get the benefits of wherever it is that I live.